Let us move forward. We have to review because we're in the middle of a very intricate sugya. We're talking about the concept of breira. And breira just basically means retroactivity, halachic retroactivity. Can the decisions that are made now reflect upon a halachic status retroactively in the past? And we're talking about the laws of tchumen. If two partners own a barrel of wine and they decide to split it on Yontif, and each one had made a separate eruv tchumen, one to the north and one to the south, do we say that since the division was made on Yontif, but you need to establish the tchum of an inanimate object at the inception of Yontif, that the division now means retroactively, whatever wine comes to me now is the wine that was mine at the inception of Yontif and therefore goes according to my eruv tchumen? Or do we say that the wine is limited by each partner? So therefore, I can't go further to the north than my partner can, and since he made an eruv to the south, he limits me, and vice versa. This is the machlokus that we were discussing yesterday, and we said that it's a machlokus between Rabbi Hoshia and Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Hoshia says yesh breira, so therefore retroactivity works, and therefore each partner can go wherever he wants. And Rabbi Yochanan had said ein breira. So the Gemara now had challenged that. The Gemara had said, let me show you how Rabbi Hoshia doesn't hold of breira. How can you tell me that Rabbi Hoshia holds of breira? What about the case of the corpse that's in the house, where Rabbi Hoshia had said that if I designate that I'm going to remove the corpse out of one of the doorways, then none of the other doorways are considered to be containing tumah. But Rabbi Hoshia said that it doesn't work retroactively, and it's only if kalim, utensils, are placed in the doorway after I make that decision, that the kalim do not become tummy in the other doorways. But we don't say that it works retroactively. Just because I decide this morning that I'm going to take the corpse out of that door, then the kalim that were positioned in the other doorways at night still are going to be tummy. It doesn't retroactively have that effect. So you see that Rabbi Hoshia doesn't hold of breira. So the Gemara then had concluded, well, it must be we got the opinions reversed. It's Rabbi Yochanan who holds of breira, and Rabbi Hoshia doesn't hold of breira. But the Gemara says, but how can you say that? I can show you that Rabbi Yochanan also doesn't hold of breira. Where is that? Because we have the case of two brothers who inherit an estate from their father. And the halacha is that at Yovel, they have to revert everything back to the original mixture of an estate of the father. Because why? Because we look at the brothers as dividing the estate and bartering each other's portion of the estate with each other, right? And we don't look at it as retroactively if one brother took the northern part of the field and the other brother took the southern part of the field, then retroactively that was the designation at the time of the death of the father, because we don't hold of retroactivity. So you see that Rabbi Yochanan doesn't hold of breira either. So what are you going to do? So the Gemara says, maybe here's one solution, possibly. And that solution would be is that Rabbi Yochanan really, when it comes to biblical law, like laws of inheritance, does not hold of breira. But when it comes to rabbinic law, like establishing tchumen, because tchumen is d'Rabbanan in this discussion, so then maybe he holds that you can rely on breira, retroactivity, to allow you to transport the wine wherever you're going. The Gemara says, but now I'm going to show you that Rabbi Yochanan doesn't even hold of breira when it comes to d'Rabbanans, when it comes to rabbinic law. And the case that this is where we're up to, because it says we're 2 lines from the bottom, Vahatani ayo, Lamed Zayin Amud Beis at the bottom, Vahatani ayo, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Ein adam masna al shnei dvarim ke'echad, ela im ba chacham lemizrach eruva lemizrach, lemayrav eruva lemayrav. So the Rabbi Yehuda was quoted as saying as follows. Here we have a guy we're dealing with the laws of tchumen. We have a guy who wants to go to a shir on Yontif for Shabbos, and he hears that there are 2 Talmidei Chachamim that are coming to town. One is coming from the east, and the other one is coming from the west. East Coast versus West Coast rabbis. You know, it's like the big feud, right? So you got one rabbi coming from the east, one rabbi's coming from the west, and I have a decision to make, because if I want to go hear the rabbi from the east, I got to make an eruv tchumen, because he's not going to be coming right to me. He's going to be somewhere within 4,000 amos away from me in the east. The other rabbi is going to be within 4,000 amos in the west. So I figure, you know what? I haven't decided yet which one I want to hear. So I'm going to make an eruv tchumen on both sides, and tomorrow morning I'll decide which one I want to go listen to. So Rabbi Yehuda says you can't do that. right? But what you are allowed to do, that's v'ilu lakan lakan lo. But what you are allowed to do is you're allowed to make 2 Erev Tchumins in the event that you don't know, there's only one rabbi coming, but you just don't know whether he's coming from the east or the west. In that case, Rabbi Yehuda says that it does work. And in the morning, when you find out which one, the rabbi's, which direction he's coming from, then you can say, okay, I want that Erev to work. And it sounds like it's working retroactively. So v'havinan ba maishna lakana lakan delo de ein breira. So mizrach ma'ariv nami ein breira. So the question is, make up your mind. Do you either hold of breira or you don't hold of breira? If you don't hold of breira, then I can understand why you can't decide Yontif morning which shir you want to go to. But by that same token, if you're not sure which one direction the rabbi's coming from, if he's coming Yontif morning and you don't know where he's coming from, you can't decide Yontif morning which Erev is a good Erev, which Erev is not a good Erev, because the Erev has to be Kona Shvisa, it has to be activated at the inception of Yontif. You can't have it be activated on Yontif itself. So you have to rely on Breira there too. So the Gemara answers, V'amar Rabbi Yochanan, so Rabbi Yochanan clarified, Uchavar Bachacham. Rabbi Yochanan says, you're right, there is no breira being operative in this instance. What's happening is like this. The rabbi is coming before Yontif, but I have a lack of knowledge. I simply don't know what direction he's coming from. So I put down 2 Erevs, one in the east and one in the west, and I basically say, whichever direction the rabbi is coming from, that's the one, that's the Erev, the parcel of food that I want to be activated at the inception of Yontif. It's not working retroactively, it's working from the time of Yontif's inception. But what you see, for the way that Rabbi Yochanan explains this, is that Rabbi Yochanan also doesn't hold of Breira. So now we've got a dilemma. Rabbi Hoshea doesn't hold of Breira from the case of the corpse. Rabbi Yochanan doesn't hold of Breira because of the case of inheritance, and we furthermore prove that he doesn't even hold of Breira from rabbinic law either. So how are we going to resolve this?
Because it's your argument whether it's Tchum is biblical or rabbinic. Could not say that Rabbi Yochanan holds that it's Midoraisa.
So that makes things even worse.
No, Midorabonis. No, he's saying you can't go. So if you're Midoraisa, no?
But even Rabbi Yochanan says we don't say Breira by Tchumen. So if it's the Rabbanan, we've proven our point that he doesn't even hold the Breira.
But we can answer also that he holds that Tchumim is Midoraisa. And if he
does, so what does it mean to say about the case of our wine? What does that do with our wine? Our wine is also Tchumim. So who holds by wine that you hold retroactivity? So Ela la'olam lo teipoch v'chiles le Rabbi Oshia Breira b'deoraisa avol b'derabbanan islam. So the Gemara's conclusion is, go back to saying that we shouldn't switch the positions. Really, Rabbi Oshia is the one who holds of Breira. Rabbi Yochanan, we've shown, does not hold of Breira, neither for rabbinic or biblical law. We've shown that Rabbi Hoshea holds of Breira, but in the case of the corpse in the doorways. But that's biblical. So what we'll tell you is Rabbi Hoshea only holds of Breira in biblical law, but he doesn't hold of, he only holds that you don't say Breira when it comes to biblical law, but we do say Breira when it comes to rabbinic law. We can be lenient and say retroactivity works. And therefore, Rabbi Oshia is the one who permits the wine for the partners to go in opposite directions. Darash Mar Zutra halacha ka Rabbi Oshia. And Mar Zutra says that the halacha is like Rabbi Oshia, and Amar Shmuel, meaning that if the two partners decide Yontif morning to split the wine, and they have different tchumen, each one can take it to his tchum. Amar Shmuel, Shor shel patam hareu karagle kolabda. So going back to the topic of our Mishnah, which was that an animal assumes the tchum of its owner, and we had said that if you, and we had given a number of permutations. Here's another permutation. If there is a regional distributor of cattle, now when I say regional distributor, he's called a patam, which means the person who fattens animals professionally and sells them to a very large radius of customers. Both the people that live in his village and people that live outside of his village will come from all over. So such a person, when Yontif comes in and he knows that people may be coming from all over, even from places outside of his own tchum, because they'll make an Erev Tchumen, he says, you know what? Each one of my cattle is designated at the inception of Yontif for the future customer. And that works. Because basically you're saying, Breira is saying, whoever buys this cow, it automatically, retroactively has that guy's tchum. So that's also what you can say. And shor shel roa harehu karagle osa ha'ir. But if you have cattle that's being held by a shepherd, and the difference between a patam and a roa, there are two terms for a cattle raiser. One's a regional distributor, and the other one's a small town distributor. He's a shepherd who just takes care of the cattle of the town, and sometimes he sells also cattle, but only to the village folk of his town. So therefore, if a person comes from outside the tchum, he cannot take that cattle and take it back to his tchum because the shepherd never had that person in mind. He only has in mind the people of his own village, and therefore each one of his cattle is restrained by the village's tchum, not by anyone from outside the tchum. Next, Hashol kli mechaveru me'erev Yom Tov. If a person borrows a utensil from his friend from before Yantiv, so since he's taken possession of the kli from before Yantiv, it follows the tchum of the borrower. So the Gemara says, Pshita, isn't that obvious? I mean, after all, the guy's got it in his possession before Yantiv, so why would you think otherwise? Lo tzricha shelo masru lo ela b'yom tov. Mahu detei malav birshu seuk me kamash malan. The chiddush is that even I go over to Mark before Yantiv, I say, Mark, I'd like to borrow what do I want to borrow from Mark? Well, I want to borrow your sefer. Mark, can I borrow your sefer? And Mark says, sure. But I say, okay, I'll come Yantif morning on my way to shul and I'll pick it up from your house. So the thing is, and now I want to go outside the tchum because I made an erev tchumen in the north and I want to take the sefer with me. So you might have argued, since I didn't take actual physical possession of the sefer until Yantif morning, then it doesn't go according to my tchum. The chiddush of the Mishnah is, since you verbally consented that it was mine for Yantif, then I get a chance to take it, and it goes according to my tchum. Misayeh leila Rabbi Yochanan, this supports Rabbi Yochanan. The Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Hashol kli mechaverim erev Yom Tov, afal pi shelo naslo ela b'Yom Tov, or yikoragle Hashol. He said the exact same thing. That as long as the lender gives verbal consent that it's going to belong to the borrower for Yantif, then even if the borrower doesn't take physical possession until Yantif itself, after the Yantif is already set in, it still goes according to the domain of the borrower. The Yom Tov Karagle Hamashul, the next line of the Mishnah was that on Yantif itself, if you borrow something on Yantif itself, it's already too late, and therefore the Kli is affixed to the domain to the tchum of the lender, not the borrower. So the Gemara says that too is pshita. Isn't that too obvious? Because it wasn't the borrowers at the inception of Yantif. Lo tzricha derogel v'sha'il minei. Mahu detemer b'rshusei ka mokim lei. Kamash Malan. So the answer is, says the Gemara, is that we're talking about a case where I borrow Sfarim from Mark all the time. And what happened is that, for the last several Yamim Tovim, I needed to borrow a machzer from Mark. And Mark knew that I was probably going to call him before Yantif and ask him if I could borrow his machzer again. But I didn't call him before Yantif. So therefore, you might have thought that Mark, in anticipating that I would want to borrow it, designates the sefer for me, and therefore goes according to my tchum, kamash malan, that it doesn't. Because since I didn't ask to borrow it before Yantif, and I didn't pick it up before Yantif, it maintains Mark's domain. Because Meimar Omar Dilma Mishakach Inishachrina Va'azul V'Shail Minei. And the reason is because Mark will say to himself, well, listen, Korobkin didn't call me before Yantif, he didn't come knocking before Yantif, so maybe he found someone else to mooch off of a machzer, right? So therefore, he doesn't have in mind to give it to me this Yantif, and therefore it stays with Mark's tchum.
Is that true even on a chazaka?
What does that mean, chazaka? Chazaka to borrow?
3 years you've done it. He knows.
No, that's not.
Rabbi Korobkin calls me for their sefer.
That's a figurative chazaka. That's not a literal chazaka. There's no halachic chazaka just because I mooch off of a guy 3 times.
I did third year with a bottom one.
Thank you. Okay. And similarly, if a woman, now this gets into a very complex, there's a lot of challenge in actually the girsa of this Gemara. I think that there's something missing from this Gemara, but we're going to read it as is, and we'll learn it the way Tosfos and Rashi understand the sugya. If a woman borrows water, salt, spices from her friend in order to bake bread or to cook a stew, then the halacha is that the bread that she bakes is limited by the tchum of both herself and the woman who gave her the ingredients. So she provides her own flour. She borrows water, salt, and whatever from her friend. So now this bread is limited by her tchum and her friend's tchum. She can't go beyond her tchum and she can't go beyond her friend's tchum because this bread is a combination. I'm saying she can't take the bread beyond that because the bread is a combination. So, Kisolik Rabbi Abba Amar Yehirava de Imamilsa de Tiskabel. So Rabbi Abba once was traveling to Eretz Yisrael, and he said a tefillah. He said, "May it be Hashem, may it be your will that I say something that will be well accepted. I don't want to make a fool out of myself when I go to the Beis Medrash, and please Hashem, make sure that I don't say something foolish." It was a good tefillah, as you'll see in just a second. Kisolek ashkechei la Rabbi Yochanan v'Rabbi Chanina bar Papi v'Rab Zera v'Amri lo Rabbi Avo v'Rab Shimon ben Pazi v'Rabbi Nafcha. He encounters three sages. We're not sure which of the three sages there were. There's two choices, but in any event, v'yasi ka'amri amai v'liftil maimu melech lagabe is. He encounters these rabbis having a discussion about our mission, and they say we don't understand why the water and the salt should inhibit this bread from being taken according to the woman who's baking it. Because after all, it's a minority ingredient, so it should be considered to be bottle to the flour. And so whatever the status of the flour is, that should define the tchum of the entire bread. What about the laws of bittul, right? You go according to the majority. So Amar Lahu Rabbi Abba, Aryai shenisariv lo kav chitin ba'asara kabin chitin shel chavero yochal halav echadi, question mark. So Rabbi Abba responds to them. He says, let me ask you a rhetorical question. Let's say I have a kav, a measure of flour, of wheat flour, and it gets mixed in accidentally with 10 kavs of your flour. Now you have 11 kavs of flour, one of them is mine. Does that mean because my flour is in the minority, you could eat all of that flour joyfully, meaning without having to feel that you need to compensate me for my measure of flour? So what's Rabbi Abba basically saying? He's saying that there's a difference between Isser veheter, a question of halachic status, and a financial stake in something. When a person has a financial stake in something, you don't say, well, if it got mixed in with someone else's finances, it's batel barov. If I throw $5 into a pot where you have $50, does that mean that my $5 is batel? Of course not. You've got $55, 5 of that is still mine. You don't say bittul when it comes to finances. And so if that's the case, his argument is like this. The laws of tchum are based on who's a financial stakeholder in the object that's in front of us. So therefore, the laws of tchumin, since they're based on finances, you can't apply the laws of bittul. So therefore, when the woman contributes her water and salt, she's still a financial stakeholder, and therefore there's no bittul. So let's see what happens. So the Gemara says, Achichu alei. So these three rabbis laughed at him. Obviously the prayer didn't work. Right? He wanted not to make a fool of himself, but they felt that he was being ridiculous. So Amr Lahu, Gulsaichu Shakli. So he said to them, did I steal your undergarments? Like, why are you laughing? Did I do something slapsticky? So the Gemara says, Hadar Achichu alei. They laughed again at him. Now there's depth to this Gemara. I'm telling you, there's more to this back and forth than meets the eye. But let's take it at face value for now. They laughed at him again. So Amar Rav Oshia, Shaper Avad de Achichu alei. Ma'ishna chitin bisarim delo ka'amr lahu da'avalei min b'sheinu minu batal. Chitin b'chitin nami dehidel Rabbi Yehuda lo batal Rabbanan miftal batal. So the reason, so comes along Rav Oshia, and he says, you know what? These rabbis were justified in laughing at Rabbi Abba. Because after all, look at the example that he provided in his rhetorical question. He was talking about 1 kav of wheat flour that gets mixed in with 10 kavs of the other guy's wheat flour. Why did he give that example? Because he holds that there's no bittul in that case, that there's no such thing as min b'mino. If one thing of the same species gets mixed into a larger mixture of that very same thing, there's no bittul. We don't say bittul in that case because min b'mino ain't no bittul. The only thing that's bittul is min b'she'eno mino. If, for example, a measure of barley flour gets mixed into a larger amount of wheat flour, that's where we apply the laws of bittul. So he says, Rav Oshia, but that's only true according to Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda is the only Tana who holds that min b'mino, two of the same kind the laws of bittul do not apply. But the rabbis hold that if you have min b'mino, there is bittul, there is nullification. So why did he only give the example of wheat flour and wheat flour? He could have given any example. So that's why they laughed at him. So the Gemara now says, Amar le Rav Safra, Moshe Shapir Ka'amart. So Rav Safra now turns to Rav Oshia, and he says, I don't understand. Moshe, that's a declaration. Are you really saying the correct thing, that they were right in laughing at Rabbi Abba? He actually has a good argument, Rabbi Abba. V'lo shamia lehu hada amar Rabbi Chia katusfa'a mishmei derav haborer tzeroros migrano shel chavero chayev l'shalim lo demei chitim. There's a halacha that if a person has a silo filled with wheat flour, or actually wheat, right, wheat kernels, and the purpose of this silo of wheat kernels is to take it to the marketplace to sell. So I figured, you know what, I want to do a favor for my friend. I noticed that there's a small percentage of pebbles mixed into his wheat kernels. I'll be a nice guy and I'll remove them for him. He comes and he sees what I've done. I've taken out 10 pounds of pebbles from his silo. And he starts yelling at me. What are you doing? What are you doing? You've caused me great financial loss. Because now I had a total, before you did me this big favor, I had 100 pounds of wheat. Now I only have 90 pounds of wheat. So the guy says, but I just took out the pebbles. They're insignificant. That's not the wheat. He says, that's not true. Because when I take it to the marketplace, people buy wheat that has a small percentage of pebbles mixed in with it. You know, like the FDA came out with a study how many rat hairs you're allowed to have in chocolate bars. Remember that that whole, you know what I'm talking about? Like there's a certain
Not Canada.
Right, there's a certain acceptable level of chazarai that's allowed to be in certain products where you're not obligated to refine it to such a large point. In the marketplace, when you buy wheat, it's acceptable to have a certain small percentage of pebbles in the wheat. That's what the customer knows he's buying. So when a person buys a pound of wheat, he knows that, okay, maybe 1% will be pebbles. But now you've caused me to have less of that final product that's sold. I can't sell it for more than the market will bear, and I have to sell it for the same price that I would have sold wheat with pebbles in it. So you've caused me a financial loss, and therefore, and the guy actually has to pay. The guy who thought he was doing him a favor has to pay him for the 10 pounds of pebbles that he removed from his silo. So in any event, what you see from here is that something that you might argue is insignificant when it comes to financial issues is significant. What are you going to tell me? The pebbles are not really wheat. They don't count for anything. But when it comes to money, when it comes to financial obligations, we don't say the laws of bittul, and we don't say that you don't have to reckon with it. So alma kilo chasrei hachanami kilo chasrei. So you see that if there's a certain measure that the guy caused him to be deficient, so too over here, that if a person has a financial stake in the dough, so then that person still counts as a stakeholder. And that's why the woman who contributes the water and the salt, you can't say bittul. That's basically the argument, the analogy that he's making from the pebbles in the wheat. So Amar le Abaye. So then Abaye now turns to Rav Safra, and he says to him, I don't understand why you're defending Rabbi Oshia. V'lo shani le lamar bein mamon sheyesh lo tovin lemamon she'en lo tovin. He says, think about it for a second. Okay, fine, you're telling me that this woman is a stakeholder because she still has a financial interest. But for Yantif, she's completely forgone her financial interest. She's given her the water and the salt and said, you don't have to pay me back till after Yantif. That's what we call mamon she'en lo tovin, money or a financial instrument that no one is actually asking for, no one's actually demanding. So therefore, since she's forgone it, she's given it up to this woman, she's relinquished her financial stake in the water and the salt for Yantiv, and therefore you can dispense with her tchum. So Amar lei v'li taimeich. So comes back Rav Safra and says, Hada Amar Rav Chisda, nevela betela b'shchuta lefi she'iyef shel shchuta sheteyos nevela. Shchuta eina betela b'nevela lefi she'ef shel nevela sheteyos shechuta. This is where it gets a little bit rocky, but let me just tell you what Rav Chisda says. Rav Chisda says that if you have, now we're going according to Rebbe Yehuda. Rav Chisda is going according to Rebbe Yehuda, who says min b'mino. If two things are of the same kind, they're not batal. But if they're of the same kind, if they're of different kinds, there is bittul. Now, if you have kosher meat mixed with treifa meat, with nevela, that's min b'she'eno mino. So therefore, at least theoretically, so if you have a small piece of nevela that gets mixed in with larger pieces of kosher meat, that nevela we say is bottle because it's min b'she'eno mino. However, if you have a small piece of kosher meat that gets mixed in with a larger amount of treifa meat, then the shchuta meat is not going to be bottle. Why is it not now? Vis-a-vis what? Vis-a-vis the laws of tumah, because nevela transmits tumah, kosher meat does not transmit tumah. So therefore, if something that is holy touches one of those pieces of meat, then we don't say, well, it's all of the kosher meat is bottle and is considered to be nevela. No, we now have a suffix. Not for sure do we know that this is tameh. Or we have a suffix whether this object is now tameh because maybe it touched the kosher piece of meat and not the nevela. Now, why is it that if kosher meat falls into a larger mixture of nevela, that we say that it's not bottle because it's min b'mina? Why? Because it's possible for the nevela to become kosher. Now, what does that mean? Because it's possible for the nevela to become kosher. So Rashi explains, because nevela meat can become rotten and deteriorate and become putrid to the point where it doesn't transmit tumah anymore. Because nevela only transmits tumah as long as it's edible. Once it's no longer edible, it no longer transmits tumah. It's not considered meat anymore of a dead animal. And therefore, it has the ability to change its halachic status to becoming min b'mino, the same status as the kosher meat, vis-a-vis the laws of tumah. And therefore, we would say that the kosher meat does not become tameh. Now, let me ask you a question, he says. He says, Hachanami, dichi islei ba'olim lo batla. Now, let me ask you something. Using this principle of Rav Chisda that min b'mino is not bottle, even when you're dealing with two different kinds, as long as in theory one could revert to the other. So let me ask you a question. Let's say the kosher meat belonged to one party and the nevela meat belongs to another party. According to what you're saying is because you have two different stakeholders, it's really two different kinds and they can't revert to each other, and therefore it should be called min b'she'eno min. It should be called, and it should be bottle. Is that what you're going to suggest? Is that what you're arguing? That doesn't make any sense. Now, at this point, Tosfos says that it seems like Abaya doesn't make any sense. Because essentially what Rav Safra was arguing is that when there's a financial stake, there's no laws of bittul. And what is Abaya responding to him? When it comes to the laws of bittul, right, what are you going to say? That two different owners are going to prevent the laws of bittul? Mm-hmm. Essentially the way you learn it is like this. What Abaya is arguing is the laws of bittul is one realm of halacha, and the laws of financial stakeholding is another realm of halacha. Never shall the twain meet. You can't apply the laws of one to the laws of the other. And so just like the laws of bittul are regulated by one standard of law, and just because there's different financial interests, that does not affect the laws of bittul, so too vice versa. When a law is regulated by financial stakeholders, then you can't apply the laws of bittul. So by the laws of Tchumen, since the law of Tchumen is regulated by who has a financial stake in the object, who's the owner of the object, the laws of bittul simply do not apply. That's really why what Rav Safra is arguing to Abaya by using this whole line of argument. And then you have to sort of explain now, he's going further in the argument. Maybe you'll tell me that ultimately, when there's no ownership, there's no financial stake on this object right now because the woman has relinquished her stakeholding on the water and the salt, maybe you'll tell me that she's not a financial stakeholder anymore, and that's why the water and the salt should be bottle. V'hatanya, but we know that that's not true, because Amar Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri cheftzei hefker konen shvisa afal pi she'ein lehem ba'olim. Domen kamisha yesh lehem ba'olim. He says, but don't we know that Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri had said that even an object that's hefker, that is ownerless, but because it is, from a financial standpoint, has value, it's kona shvisa for itself as if it has an owner. And therefore, you can't move the object more than 2,000 amos from where it was at the inception of Yontif. So if that's the case, you see even a hefker object is kona shvisa, has a tchum. So therefore, just because this woman who gave the water and the salt doesn't have a vested financial interest in it right now, still it was kona shvisa at the inception of Yom Tov based upon what her status was. And in other words, just because she's not asking for the water and salt back on Yom Tov doesn't mean that she's not a financial stakeholder in the water and the salt. And bottom line is, says Rav Safra, I don't understand why people were laughing at Rabbi Abba. Because Rabbi Abba was saying a legitimate argument. His argument is that when there's a halacha that's based on financial stakeholding, then you don't apply the laws of bittul. And that's the reason why the water and the salt should not be batel. So Amar Lei, so Abaye responds to him and says, Mi kamedames isura lemamona, isura batel mamona lo batel. Abaye's final response to him was, but your argument, and Rabbi Abba's argument, is no good. Because even though the laws of Tchumen have some connection to finances, to ownership, nevertheless, it is regulated by the laws of Isser v'Heter. Because ultimately, what does the laws of Tchumen tell you? You're allowed to go somewhere and you're not allowed to go somewhere. That's Isser v'Heter. Granted, you Rabbi Abba and you Rav Safra try to argue that because that Heter, an Isser of where I'm allowed to go, where I'm not allowed to go, is based upon who's the financial stakeholder, but you're mixing and matching. Because this is not purely a financial halacha. This is a question of Hilchas Yantif. Where am I allowed to go? And then once we're dealing with Hilchas Yantif of Isser v'Heter, then we do apply the laws of Bittul. So that's the final statement of Abaye, and that's why he defends the action of the rabbis to laugh at Rabbi Abba, because he was trying to mix and match something that doesn't mix. So now the Gemara says, V'tay mamai. So finally, Taco, then what's the reason? What's the reason? Now, so fine. So now you've proven to me that the laws of Bittul should apply to the case of the dough. Well, then why is it that the Mishnah Taka says what it says? That the woman who contributed the water and the salt restricts the movement of the bread. So the Gemara answers, Abaye Omar Gzeira Shematase Isa B'Shutfis. Abaye says one reason. Because even though technically you're right, she should not restrict the movement of the bread because it should be bottle, but we made a general takana and said that any time two people are partners in dough, then they restrict each other's movement, because let's say the next time two women will get together, she'll contribute half the flour and she'll contribute half the flour, she'll contribute half the water, they'll be equal partners in all the ingredients. If we allow them to, certainly the loaf of bread is restricted by their common area. And if one made a tchum this way, the other one made a tchum that way, then the bread is restricted to not go beyond either one's tchum. And if we allow you to be liberal in the case where one woman contributed the water, the other one contributed the flour, then you may become liberal in the case when they're equal owners in the flour. That's the answers that Abaye gives. Rava Amar Tablin Latame Avida V'Tame Lo Batel. Rava says, I have another answer. My answer is it's got nothing to do with this, lest you come to this, but rather it's because when a woman contributes salt or she contributes spices, those things are still detectable within the potted food or within the dough. Since you can still taste those things, that's why it's not batel. And we have this halacha in Yoredeya as well, that if a person takes something that's treifed, we say that it's batel b'shishim, that it's batel in 60 parts of the permitted substance, but that's only true if you can't taste it anymore. But if you can still taste it, it's not batel. And therefore, Rava's argument is, these ingredients, the water and the salt, are still detectable in the final product, and spices too. And therefore, you can't say that it's batel. And Ravashi Amar Mishum Dahavi lei davar sheyesh lo matirin b'chol davar sheyesh lo matirin afilu be'elef lo batel. Ravashi gives his third answer, and that is like this. And we had seen this at the beginning of Maseches BEITZA. There's a concept of davar sheyesh lo matirin. If something is prohibited right now on Yantif, but after Yantif it will not be prohibited, then we don't allow bittul to take place on Yantif, because the argument of the Gemara is Ad shetochlena be'isser tochlena beheter. Don't rely on bittul in order to allow you to eat it. Just wait until Yantif is over, and you'll be able to eat it in its permitted state. instead of relying on bittul. And so here too, this woman contributes the water and the salt. If you want to say bittul to allow you to travel farther, there's no such thing as bittul with something that's only temporarily usher on Yontif. Just wait until after Yontif and you'll take it wherever you want to go. And that's why, says Rav Ashi, that the water and the salt is not bittul, even though you should argue that it should be. And this is where we'll hold it here for today.
Shraga.
Wonderful.